My name is Shannon Allen. I'm a doctoral student at Liberty University School of Behavioral Sciences, where I'm working towards my Ph.D. in general psychology. My educational background and research interests include trauma, crisis, and violence. Today's lecture will discuss the development of adolescent aggression through the moral disengagement process. This presentation will begin with definitions and the leading theoretical framework for the study of moral disengagement. The problem of moral disengagement in adolescence will be placed in a context to emphasize the importance and relevance of the topic. The loci and mechanisms of moral disengagement will be thoroughly explained. Then we will look at the predominant risk factors leading to moral disengagement. And finally, I will discuss other similar theories that may explain morally transgressive behaviors. Let's start by defining morality. Morality is the endeavor of humans to establish principles that distinguish between right and wrong in both thinking and actions. Ensuring social harmony relies heavily on upholding moral principles. Children begin to internalize moral norms and learn to behave in accordance with societal standards from an early age, which demonstrates effective socialization. Individuals are driven to adhere to ethical norms. Deviating from moral principles that are commonly accepted within societies often results in social sanctions. And going against one's own moral convictions leads to negative moral feelings such as shame or guilt. Developmental theorist Albert Bandura conceived of and empirically validated the construct of moral disengagement as an extension of his social learning theory. Moral agency is a key aspect of social learning theory. Moral agency refers to the degree to which people make decisions based on their moral judgment and are responsible for their actions. Children assimilate moral principles throughout their development, which function as a framework for moral behavior. These standards are established by witnessing those who conform to social norms, receiving explicit guidance from others on proper moral conduct, and facing consequences when moral rules are violated. The expectation of both personal and societal consequences for participating in infractions, as well as the subsequent feeling of moral distress, act as motivators to conform to these internalized norms. However, the use of self-regulatory systems to restrain immoral conduct is influenced not just by internal variables, but also by context. Moral behavior is influenced by a combination of personal variables, such as moral standards and self-imposed consequences for immoral actions, as well as external influences such as social punishments for immoral activity. These factors also shape future behavior. The three forms of influence, behavioral, personal, and environmental, are interconnected in a triadic paradigm known as reciprocal determinism. They usually work together to prevent individuals who have embraced moral norms from engaging in infractions. However, under some circumstances, individuals have the ability to separate their moral principles from the consequences they impose on themselves. This enables them to participate in an ethical behavior without feeling that they have violated their own moral code through cognitive reconstruction mechanisms, which I will discuss shortly. Following Bandura's empirical study on moral disengagement and aggression, there has been a significant surge in research on moral disengagement, particularly focusing on children and adolescents. This demographic is of special significance since research has shown that moral disengagement reaches its highest point during middle adolescence and leads to bullying, aggression, violence, criminal conduct, and antisocial behaviors. These behaviors have the potential to impact individuals throughout their lifespan and also have adverse impacts on families, peers, and the whole of society. Bandura identified 8 moral disengagement mechanisms that facilitate aggressive, violent, and antisocial behaviors. These are categorized into 4 loci. Under the behavioral locus is first moral justification. Moral justification is the reconstruction of detrimental behavior in a way that makes it socially acceptable, righteous, or serving a greater good. For instance, one may say, I did everyone a favor by beating that kid up because he's a jerk. The second behavioral mechanism is advantageous comparison. This mechanism utilizes the contrast principle, which is based on the belief that the way people perceive human behavior is impacted by what it is contrasted to. Individuals compare the behavior to other instances of more deleterious behaviors, so diminishing the significance of their own actions. The greater the immortality of the contrasted activity, the more probable it is that one's damaging behavior will seem less reprehensible. An example would be justifying stealing an Xbox game by stating that another kid stole the whole console. The final behavioral mechanism is euphemistic labeling. Euphemistic labeling is the use of words or labels that mitigate the negative connotations associated with a behavior. By use of less severe or impartial language, people might reduce the moral ramifications of their actions. For instance, one may say, I didn't steal her phone, I just borrowed it. There's one mechanism under the outcome locus. Minimizing the consequences is pretty self-explanatory. This mechanism involves distorting, denying, or ignoring the harmful consequences of immoral behaviors. For instance, one may claim after vandalizing their school, it's no big deal, no one got hurt. Under the agency loci are 2 mechanisms. The first, displacement of responsibility, involves justifying immoral behaviors by shifting responsibilities to individuals in leadership positions who sanctioned or should have prevented the behaviors. For instance, a bully may believe that if a teacher fails to stop the bullying, then it's the teacher's fault. Similarly, under the agency loci is the fusion of responsibility. This involves placing blame on the group. For example, one may say, everyone else was doing it. The last locus involves the victim, and the mechanisms employed are dehumanization and attribution of blame. Dehumanization involves treating victims with less empathy and moral concern, stripping them of human qualities, or describing them with negative attributes. For example, one may say, I punched him because he was acting like an animal. Attribution of blame is essentially victim blaming, blaming the victim for their plight, blaming the circumstances, or blaming them as a response to provocation. For instance, one may say, she's always flaunting and bragging about her expensive phone, so I took it and broke it. She only has herself to blame. Now, let's look at factors that may lead to disengagement behaviors. First is bully bystanding and reinforcement. Bully bystanders can be viewed as passive or active. Passive bystanders do not try to stop the bullying. Active bystanders reinforce bullying behaviors by, for example, inciting the bullying, bringing others to watch, and laughing at or verbally encouraging the bullying. Both types of bystanders have scored high in moral disengagement. Research has also found a positive correlation between moral disengagement and online interactions, including internet usage and violent video game material, in addition to peer hostility. Moral disengagement was linked to violent video games via the moral processes of justification, distortion of consequences, and dehumanization. It's crucial to note that antisocial acts are not isolated. According to Bandura's reciprocal determinism paradigm, intrapsychic influences might impact moral engagement and its psychological consequences. Moral disengagement and inadequate self-regulation were notable research findings. Impulsivity, aggressive emotionality, rumination, and emotion dysregulation correlated with self-regulation. Poor self-regulation often leads to lower self-monitoring and greater transgressive behaviors. Immoral behavior is more easily divorced from moral norms in people with poorer self-regulation, since self-regulatory systems only kick in when triggered. Underpinning self-regulation is self-efficacy, which is the conviction in one's capacity to govern one's functioning. Research indicates that moral disengagement is negatively associated with self-efficacy, including empathetic, self-regulatory, and intellectual self-efficacy. Bandura suggested that self-efficacy influenced motivation and self-regulation. Low self-efficacy limits motivation and emotional resources for self-regulation, leading to unethical behavior and increased aggression. Research suggests that self-efficacy can prevent moral disengagement mechanisms, supporting previous findings that high regulatory self-efficacy is associated with lower aggressive behaviors. These results align with Bandura's reciprocal determination model, showing how personal characteristics like self-efficacy impact behavior and self-regulation. Research has also found a correlation between moral disengagement and increased antisocial personality characteristics and decreased positive attributes. These results emphasize the significance of internalizing moral norms and their evolution throughout time. Importantly, moral disengagement, poor self-evaluation, and psychological discomfort are linked. According to Bandura, moral disengagement is linked to decreased levels of negative self-evaluation, including guilt. Since moral disengagement absolves transgressors of guilt, it is believed to also prevent negative psychological effects from immoral activity. However, moral disengagement goes beyond disposition. Again, according to Bandura's reciprocal determinism hypothesis, moral disengagement is selectively used based on the circumstances of infractions. The contextual process of moral disengagement examines societal elements that may promote its enlistment. For example, Youth who experienced peer rejection had increased moral disengagement. Moral disengagement and peer rejection may reinforce ideas of the world as unfair, thus reinforcing antisocial dispute resolutions. Further, moral disengagement might be internalized as a viable approach to attain one's objectives. In terms of parenting and the home environment, a negative family environment, including discourse between parents and within the family unit, is linked to increased moral disengagement. Negative parenting may teach children to excuse unethical actions via moral disengagement. The personal endorsement of moral disengagement mechanisms is positively connected to negative parenting behaviors such as harsh punishment and child maltreatment. Children may also learn moral disengagement mechanisms by observing and modeling parents' aggressive behaviors. And research suggests that familial violence might lead to diminished self-monitoring, perhaps making moral disengagement more likely. Decreased rates of parental monitoring is also related to moral disengagement. Finally, children living in neighborhoods where antisocial and aggressive behaviors are prevalent, moral disengagement increased with violent conduct. These results align with collective moral disengagement, where perceived social support for justifications influences individual aggression. When comparing moral disengagement to different theories of moral behavior, we may find similarities between moral disengagement and the idea of cognitive dissonance. Festinger defines cognitive dissonance as a negative psychological response that occurs when there is a discrepancy between one's moral values and their immoral actions. Individuals who experience dissonance are driven to resolve the discomfort by changes in cognitive, behavioral, or environmental variables. If a person persists in engaging in immoral actions while being aware of their detrimental nature, the cognitive dissonance will remain unresolved. It's important to note two key differences between cognitive dissonance and moral disengagement. Cognitive dissonance causes negative emotional feelings about misalignment, where moral disengagement does not immediately. Remember, one who morally disengages does so without remorse. Second, moral disengagement relies heavily on personal agency. Therefore, one can support immoral conduct through disengagement just as they can support moral conduct in a different context while upholding their normative moral standards. In other words, moral disengagement is more of a temporary state than cognitive dissonance, which involves longer-term changes to one's moral principles. From a personality approach, whole trait theory can be related to moral behavior and moral disengagement. Whole trait theory describes how individuals may generally behave the same over time, but also change their behaviors in different contexts. Theorists are increasingly considering personality structures as stable but dynamic processes, emphasizing the relevance of intrapsychic variations in human conduct across contexts. From this perspective, the context causes individual moral disparities. So, a key distinction between moral disengagement theory and whole trait theory is that moral disengagement theory holds that environmental influences are created by a generative process influenced by human agency, which flows through the environment. Because information processing affects action differently in the same situation, moral disengagement may occur. Bandura's reciprocal determination model promotes the concept that morality is not a product of the environment or a monolithic structure, but that individuals influence and are impacted by social and environmental situations. The research emphasis on human agency and moral disengagement significantly impacts scholarship on how young people view moral behavior. Certain adolescents are susceptible to encountering situations that violate or challenge their moral principles. Research covered in this lecture illustrates that these occurrences are not just confined to bullying, which seems to be the focus of many studies, but also encompasses other forms of aggressive and antisocial behavior, such as teenage violence and delinquent conduct. Environments that promote these behaviors as the norm might lead to a reciprocal impact when moral disengagement is used. Peers may have a reciprocal influence on moral disengagement, both influencing and being influenced by it, so strengthening the acceptance of immoral behavior. The reciprocal influences of these bidirectional effects, together with individual traits such as inadequate self-control and diminished empathy, shape one's likelihood of engaging in similar transgressive actions in the future and heighten the danger of continuously using tactics that detach oneself from moral obligations. Although moral disengagement may be useful in temporarily managing negative self-evaluation after engaging in transgressive behavior, persons who employ this strategy are nonetheless susceptible to experiencing severe psychological consequences in the long run. Identifying potential moderators offers valuable information on ways to intervene and decrease moral disengagement and transgressive behavior. For instance, adolescents may gain advantages from using adaptive coping mechanisms that promote self-awareness and decrease the inclination to morally disengage. Techniques such as cognitive restructuring and mindfulness may be used to effectively regulate emotions and enhance empathy. Additionally, it is crucial to intervene at both the peer and parental levels in order to cultivate supportive situations that promote moral conduct. Overall, these treatments might potentially diminish the inclination to support moral disengagement mechanisms and, as a result, lower the occurrence of violent and antisocial conduct.